So, as we prepare to reflect on worship, our practice of worship, the first question we are answering is, where do we worship? The Church Universal engages in worship as a primary communal activity. The location and the time of worship can vary widely. We worship in a church building, in a field, around a dining table in someone's home, or at the water's edge. We use symbols to help us mediate the sacred. The Bible placed open on a pedestal, a chalice and paten on the communion table, and the cross which hangs at the front of the sanctuary to remind us of the presence of the risen Christ. These are all symbols of the holy. And outdoors, we find symbols of the divine all around, in birds, in stones, and in the wind rustling in the trees. Wherever we are struck by God's beautiful presence, that is a place of worship. Sacrament is an outward expression of an invisible grace. I love that definition so much that I'm going to say it again. A sacrament is an outward expression of an invisible grace. Similarly, worship, then, is an expression of God's invisible grace. Each week, through our prayers, our reflections, and through music, we are making visible God's grace in the world.
Been at church in a while to hear the reasons why we have not seen that person on Sunday mornings. It is as if the individual we encounter needs some kind of absolution or permission granted for their absence from our weekly gathering. And the underlying message that I often glean, while not necessarily clearly articulated, is that many people feel as if they miss weekly worship. It means that somehow they do not love God or are not faithful in their Christian walk. Certainly, I would maintain that liturgy, the work of the people, the time we spend together in worship, is a central part of who we are as Christians, and it is central to what it means to live a life of faith. Worship is an opportunity to connect with the divine, an opportunity through solace, through challenge, through inspiration, through fellowship, to work for justice and to live in harmony with all creation. Worship is the place where we can bring our whole selves before God, knowing that whatever emotion or expression of faith we share, it will be honored and welcomed by the community and by God. Worship is a transformative experience for us as individuals and as a community. And yet, we ministers are not so naive or narrowly focused to think that what happens here on a Sunday morning is the only way that God is worshiped or that the divine presence is experienced. There are as many different ways to worship as there are people seeking a genuine connection with God. And while many of us find meaningful ways to worship God together in community, I also know that some of the most profound worship experiences I have had have taken place while engaged in other pursuits. Walking in the woods, or playing with a child, or listening to a concert. I have experienced worship in moments of intimacy and tenderness, in moments of laughter and reckless abandon, in moments of sighs too deep for words. Some of us worship in dance, or in a kayak, or in the kitchen. Some worship God alone, or with a trusted partner, or with a community of strangers. Some turn to music, others to art, others stillness and silence. Regardless of how it happens, when we strip it to the bare essentials, it seems to me that any moment that we foster a connection with the divine, that we are inspired by a sense of the holy, that we recognize the Christ in our midst and respond, these are moments of worship. So you might wonder, does that mean that Reverend Molly has just given all of us the great Get Out of Worship for Free card that everyone secretly wants to hold in their wallet? No, I have not. I maintain that being together as a faith family to join in worship matters. It really does. It's why Scott and Caroline are here each week. But maybe what also matters is that when you're not able to be with your faith family in worship for any one of a million reasons, you might consider how it is that you are still worshiping God. How is it that you find the time in your life to connect with the divine in your own beautiful forms of worship? How is it that you experience worship in the ways you are mindfully and purposefully living your life? Friends, when you are not with us in worship, you are missed. And every time and in every place that you find a way to meet God face to face, you have found a way to worship. So when is it that we worship? From the beginning of time as God's people, we have been reminded of the need to set time aside for worship. Our worship is governed by the rhythm of a liturgical year, moving us from Advent through Christmas, Epiphany through Lent and Easter, then on to Pentecost and into a period of what we call ordinary time. Within this cycle, there are specific seasons and days that we mark as unique and that serve as touchstones along the way. Similarly, there is a weekly rhythm to our worship as we remember the resurrection of Jesus each and every Sunday as we gather for worship. And yet, worship is not just confined to Sunday mornings, because as followers of Christ, we are called to put our worship into action, to take what it is that we have experienced together and to respond in how we choose to live our lives. So we offer our time, our talents, and our treasures as our living offering, as the tangible ways that we embody our worship in the world.
So why do we worship? What brings us here week after week? What leads us to seek out mountaintops so we can get a glimpse of the divine in creation? Well, we have a God-given need to worship, to celebrate and to express ourselves fully. And so we gather in worship to offer our praise and our thanksgiving to God. We gather to bring all of who we are to God. We bring our grief and our gratitude and our joy. The psalmist knew well the range of human experience, and so our Psalter contains psalms of praise, of wisdom, and of lament. In worship, then, we can bring to God our anger, our guilt, our shame, our fears, our gratitude, and our wonder. We can gather and be who we truly are in the presence of God and one another. And it is good.
The story of the Samaritan woman at the well is one which is familiar to many of us. This conversation, recorded only in John's Gospel, is a revealing one, full of many powerful lessons, as this nameless Samaritan woman, part of a race who were utterly despised by the Jewish people, and a forgotten outcast because of her marital status, dared to stand toe-to-toe with Jesus and ask him those questions that other people were afraid to ask. As a result of their conversation, we listeners learn that God values us enough to actively seek us, to welcome us to intimacy, and to rejoice in our worship. As a result of Jesus' conversation, only a person like the Samaritan woman, an outcast from her own people, could understand the significance of such a gift. To be wanted, to be cared for when no one, not even herself, could see anything of value in her, well, this is grace indeed. for any of us who have ever felt small or forgotten, for any of us who have ever found it hard to love ourselves, for any of us who have wondered about our worth. Like it was for the Samaritan woman, this is also good news. Because when we hear stories like this, when we see the love of God lived out in the person of Jesus and the ways that he engaged the world around him, we are given a glimpse of what it is that each one of us have been given. As children of God, as God's beloved, we too are seen, are heard, are understood to the very core of our being by the one who created us, the one who journeys with us, the one who gave his life for us. We too have received the gift of grace simply by our very existence. Our God reaches out to us with an understanding, a tenderness, a compassion that is beyond anything we can imagine, and draws us into relationship with God and with one another and with all of creation. And this gets at the heart of why it is we worship. When we have experienced such love, such possibility, such presence, when we are in need of hope or direction or courage, when we need to cry out in anger or shout for joy, when we need to be reminded that in life and in death and in life beyond death, that we are not alone, we worship. We worship because as children of God, as followers of Jesus, as human beings, we have a deep need to find moments of connection with something greater than ourselves. We worship because we hear God's call in our lives and our drive to respond overwhelms us. We worship because deep in our souls, we long to nurture the relationship we have with the one who knows us better than we know ourselves. We worship because when we come together, when we share stories, when we ask questions, when we open our hearts and listen carefully, we are reminded again and again that in all times, in all places, in all situations, God is always near.